So how does the world go to war? I mean, really, how does an entire continent, at the absolute height of its power, get plunged into one of the most brutal conflicts in human history? All because of a single gunshot? Well, today we're going to break it down.
Picture this. It's the summer of 1914. And from everything we know, it was just a beautiful time to be alive. They called it La Belle Epoque, the beautiful era. Europe was richer, more connected, and more modern than it had ever been. Honestly, if you were sitting in a cafe in Paris or a park in London, the idea of a massive war, it wasn't even on the radar. It seemed completely impossible. But here's the thing. Beneath that calm, sunny surface, something else had been building up for decades. Europe wasn't really this peaceful garden of civilization. No, it was actually a giant powder keg, just packed to the brim with explosives, basically waiting for a single tiny spark.
So how on earth did we get here? To really understand, we have to look inside that powder keg. What was it filled with? Well, it turns out it was 4 huge, interlocking, and frankly, very destructive forces that had been growing for almost 50 years.
Okay, first up, imperialism. Back then, to be considered a great power, you had to have a great empire. It was like a global game of Monopoly. Britain and France, they'd already snapped up huge chunks of the world. But then you have Germany, this brand new powerful country that was, kind of late to the party. Their leader, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was really aggressive about getting Germany its place in the sun, which led to all these tense standoffs over colonies and bred this deep, paranoid suspicion between all the major powers.
And all that suspicion? Well, it fed directly into our second force, militarism. European countries didn't just have armies, they were obsessed with them. And thanks to the Industrial Revolution, we're not talking about muskets and cannons here. We're talking about machine guns that could fire 600 rounds a minute, massive artillery that could flatten towns from miles away. This created this constant, toxic feeling that war wasn't just possible, it was inevitable.
And the most famous example of this whole thing was the insane naval arms race. Britain's entire security strategy depended on having the biggest navy in the world, period. But Germany's Kaiser, he was obsessed with building a fleet that could challenge them. When Britain launched this revolutionary new battleship, the HMS Dreadnought, in 1906, it just threw gasoline on the fire. This rivalry completely poisoned the relationship between Britain and Germany for years.
Meanwhile, back on dry land, generals were creating these incredibly rigid war plans that were all based on train timetables. And Germany's plan? It was by far the most dangerous. They were terrified of fighting a war on 2 fronts, so the Schlieffen Plan was their wild gamble: knock out France in 6 weeks by invading through neutral Belgium and then whip all their troops back around to fight Russia. But here's the critical part. Once you gave the order to mobilize, the trains had to start rolling. There was no stopping it. It was literally a war machine with no brakes.
So you might be asking, why was Germany so worried about a 2-front war in the first place? Well, that brings us to our third fatal force, alliances. It started as a clever plan by Germany to keep France isolated, but over time, it just turned into this tangled mess of secret treaties that split the entire continent down the middle.
So by 1914, Europe was basically split into these 2 massive armed camps. On one side, you had the Triple Entente. That's Great Britain, France, and Russia. And on the other, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Now, these alliances were supposed to keep the peace, act as a deterrent. But in reality, they were a series of tripwires. An attack on one country could now instantly drag everyone else into the fight.
And that brings us to the last and maybe the most volatile ingredient of all, nationalism. For a country like France, it was this burning desire for revenge, revanchism, against Germany for humiliating defeat years earlier. But the most dangerous form of nationalism was brewing in the Balkans, a region everyone called the powder keg of Europe. This is where you had the crumbling Austro-Hungarian Empire, terrified of falling apart, clashing head-on with the tiny nation of Serbia, which had this powerful dream of uniting all South Slavic people into one nation, a Yugoslavia.
So let's recap. The empires are hungry, the armies are armed to the teeth, the alliances are set like traps, and nationalist hatred is just boiling over. This whole massive, continent-wide powder keg, all it needed was a single spark.
And that spark came on June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was visiting, and he happened to pick a date that was hugely important to Serbian nationalists. Things went wrong from the start. An early assassination attempt with a bomb failed.
But then later that day, in just an unbelievable one-in-a-million twist of fate, the Archduke's driver took a wrong turn, installed the car right in front of one of the assassins, a 19-year-old kid named Gavrilo Princip.
Princip just stepped off the curb and fired 2 shots. One hit the Archduke, and the other hit his wife, Sophie. As he was bleeding to death, Ferdinand's last words were just heartbreaking, a plea for his wife to live for their children. But within minutes, both of them were gone.
You see, for the hardliners back in Austria-Hungary, this wasn't just a tragedy. Oh no, this was the perfect excuse. They didn't just want justice, they wanted to use this murder to finally crush Serbia and put an end to this nationalist threat to their empire for good. What came next was a 37-day chain reaction, a slow slide into total disaster that we now call the July Crisis.
And this is how those tripwires snapped, one after the other. First, Germany gives Austria-Hungary a blank check, basically saying, we've got your back no matter what. That emboldened Austria to send Serbia an ultimatum so harsh it was impossible to accept. When Serbia couldn't meet every single demand, Austria declared war. Then, Russia starts mobilizing its huge army to protect its ally, Serbia. That triggers Germany's rigid Schlieffen Plan, forcing them to declare war on Russia and then on France. And finally, when Germany marches its troops into neutral Belgium to get to France, Britain declares war. The dominoes had fallen.
And just like that, in a little over a month, a century of paranoia, rivalry, and really terrible planning had just erupted into flames. The world of 1914 was about to be burned away, forever.
The war that came next, it would go on for 4 of the most brutal years in history. The mechanized slaughter of trench warfare, poison gas, constant artillery, the cost is almost impossible to wrap your head around. 20 million casualties, soldiers and civilians.
But this wasn't just a war. It was a world-shattering event. It didn't just kill people, it killed empires. It completely swept away 4 ancient powers, the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, the German, and the Ottoman empires, and redrew the entire map of Europe and the Middle East, planting the seeds for an even worse war just 2 decades later.
There's this famous quote, on the very eve of Britain joining the war, its Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey was looking out his window as it got dark, and he said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." He had no idea how right he was.
So in the end, the Great War wasn't really caused by one man or one event. It was caused by leaders all across the continent who, totally blinded by their own pride and paranoia, built this magnificent, incredibly dangerous, heavily armed house of cards. And that leaves us with a pretty chilling question, right? As we try to navigate our own complex world of alliances and big rivalries, could we ever make the same mistake again?
Please like and subscribe.